Hi everyone. So in continuing our lecture series on plant growth and development, today we are going to be looking at nutrients. But first, we are going to review. So in last lecture, we looked at air, right? And we looked at air in response to plant growth and development, and there were some factors or aspects of air, particularly oxygen, carbon dioxide, humidity, and wind. And we started with oxygen, and we said oxygen is so important because oxygen is needed for cellular respiration. We've talked a lot about photosynthesis, but we haven't mentioned cellular respiration too much yet in this course. So cellular respiration is the process by which we break down that glucose molecule that is made during photosynthesis, and we break it down to create energy. Thus, anything that your plant or any process that requires energy in your plants is going to need this process of cellular respiration, and is going to require oxygen. Now there is anaerobic respiration, which doesn't require oxygen, but it's not as efficient, and it creates byproducts, and ultimately, depending on the plant, it can lead to a lot of damages or reduction in growth and even death. Right? So you really need oxygen for the cellular respiration process in order to create energy in the form of ATP that is used then for these various plant processes, including different metabolic processes, as well as pumping nutrients in the roots, right? We talked about that active transport before. So a lack of oxygen is going to limit your root growth. It's going to limit your nutrient absorption. It can lead to root death, water stress, and reduced photosynthesis. Right? And I talk about roots mostly because that's where you're going to see your oxygen deficiency. Oxygen is abundant in the atmosphere. It's about 21% of our atmosphere, but it's not as abundant in the soil. So you most often will see deficiencies in oxygen in your soil, and thus see those effects in the root system. And that is because there is no oxygen transport system in your plants. There is no system that allows your plant to take oxygen that it's getting in its leaves and transport it down into its roots, right? Not like you with your circulatory system. There's no similar system in your plants. Thus, any cells that need oxygen in your plants need to be close to a source of oxygen. So there needs to be oxygen in the soil because your plant roots are only going to get that oxygen from the soil, primarily. Now, there are some adaptations that some of our plants have, particularly our wetland plants, and they have parenchyma tissue. Again, parenchyma is a type of parenchyma. Remember, our parenchyma tissue are all around cells, right? There's a variation of it called parenchyma, which is very spongy. And that allows for easier diffusion of oxygen. So it allows for a little bit better travel of oxygen through our plants, from the leaves down to the roots, through this parenchyma tissue, right? So there are some adaptations, but in general, there is not any transport system in our plants to transport oxygen. Thus, oxygen is needed in the soil, and thus deficiencies in the soil can lead to root death and all these other problems that come with it. Now, the amount of oxygen in soil is determined by soil texture, and we've talked about texture in our last lecture when we were looking at, or maybe not our last lecture, but one of our lectures where we were looking at water availability, right? So again, pore space is going to influence oxygen. And in this case, the larger pore space, generally there'll be more oxygen, right? Because the other thing that's going to affect oxygen is your or soil saturation, or your amount of water, right? So they're kind of competing with each other for pore spaces. So if water is in that pore space, there's not going to be oxygen. So your larger particles, your sand particles with your bigger pore spaces, are generally going to have more aeration or more oxygen because there's less water in there, or less water holding capacity. Right? It's why clay soils can be difficult, or you may see this in your clay soils, because they have the small pore spaces, they hold on to water, and that water takes the space of oxygen, it displaces it. Compaction is related to this, where compaction we just have through weight, essentially, we are decreasing our pore spaces, and we can have limited oxygen or reduced oxygen in our soils that are compacted, both in our agricultural soils outside, as well as in our containers. We can see compaction. It's an issue of growing in containers in horticulture. Now we can also grow in water, and oxygen is also available in water in the form of dissolved oxygen. It's not as abundant. And the oxygen, but it's how we can grow hydroponically, right? We're growing hydroponics right now. It's because oxygen is available in our water. And the amount of dissolved oxygen is influenced by temperature and salinity, where increases in both lead to decreases in oxygen, right? The warmer the temperature and the saltier, or the warmer the water and the saltier the water, the less oxygen that there is available, or less dissolved oxygen there is available. So that is oxygen. We also looked at carbon dioxide. And we said carbon dioxide is important because it's needed for photosynthesis, right? And what do we remember? That anything that affects photosynthesis is also going to affect plant growth and development, right? Plant takes in carbon dioxide, uses water, uses photons or light energy to create that glucose molecule. And what we see is this process of actual CO2 fertilization, where an increase in carbon dioxide leads to an increase of productivity and plant growth, right? So as we've been polluting our atmosphere with carbon dioxide, we have seen some increases in plant growth as a result, both in our plants that we cultivate and in our wild plants. Now, the downside of this is that we see a corresponding decrease in the nutritional content of our plants. Now, this is related to photorespiration and stress, and we haven't talked about photorespiration yet. We will at the end of this course. But it's essentially a process by which sometimes, instead of fixing carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, when oxygen is around, our plants fix oxygen instead. And that is an inefficient process. It doesn't produce glucose, it takes up energy, and it's stress on your plants. And your plants respond to stress by creating vitamins, essentially, and more protein. Right? So the actual stress is actually boosting the nutritional quality of your plant. So by reducing the stress on your plants, you're actually making them less nutritious. And that's what's occurring with the CO2 fertilization. Lastly, we looked at humidity and wind, and we said humidity is important because it affects transpiration, with increasing amounts of humidity lowering transpiration, and that could be both good and bad, right? Good that it reduces water loss, but if there's too much humidity, we're going to prevent transpiration, and there won't be a streaming, that transpiration stream. Your plant will stop taking in water and it'll stop taking in mineral nutrients. So it could be a problem as well. And again, the opposite as well. If you have too low of humidity, it's going to increase your transpiration, and then you could have water loss that way, right? So ideally, somewhere around 50 to 60% of humidity is good. Again, that's going to vary based on the plant, but this is on average. There are also some other effects of humidity, humidity-related diseases, etc. But on average, humidity, at least 50 to 60%, is good for your plants. Lastly, we looked at wind, and we said that wind can have a couple different effects. It aids in pollination, and another kind of interesting thing is that it strengthens your stems of your young plants, right? When they bend, that is going to release hormones that are going to lead to cell growth or cell enlargement or producing more cells. And that makes your stems stronger. So a little bit of wind, and artificially, even if you just rub your hand over plants as they're growing, the young plants, it'll help strengthen their stems. So that is it. Let us get on with our lecture. Now, there are 17 essential elements that are needed by plants for their growth, development, and functioning. 3 of them, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are obtained from the air and water, and they comprise more than 95% of the dry weight of our plant. The remaining elements, 14 of them, are called mineral nutrients, and they primarily come from the soil. Now we can categorize our mineral nutrients into 2 main categories, our macronutrients and our micronutrients, with the difference between them being the amounts of each that are needed for your plants. Right, with our macronutrients are needed in greater quantities than micronutrients. Now, just because there's fewer or a lesser quantity of micronutrients are needed by your plants doesn't mean that they're not important. And in fact, there's a law of the minimum which states that even if all other elements are present in sufficient quantities, if any one element is deficient, then the plant will not grow and develop properly. Right? So they are all important for plant growth and development, but your macronutrients are needed in greater quantities than your micronutrients. Now we can further break down macronutrients into primary and secondary nutrients, with again the distinction being the quantity needed, right? With your plants requiring or needing greater quantities of primary nutrients than secondary nutrients. And if we look at them all, we see that our primary macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those should be familiar to you, right? If you've ever seen fertilizers, they often have the amounts by weight of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium listed on that fertilizer, the NPK numbers. Our secondary nutrients are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And our micronutrients are boron, copper, chlorine, iron, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and zinc. I'm not going to require you to know all of these, but be aware of those primary macronutrients in particular, right? I want you to know those. Now, some other properties of our essential elements or our mineral nutrients, they can have interacting effects, right? And sometimes they can either be positive or negative. So a positive interaction is potassium and calcium. Potassium uptake can be enhanced by adding calcium to the soil, where a negative interaction could be calcium and magnesium, where an excess in one can lead to a deficiency in the other. Another important property of our elements are mobility, right? With some nutrients being more mobile than others. Now, mobile elements are able to translocate from one area of a plant to another. And this is going to help when we're trying to diagnose nutrient deficiencies. Because as our plants are growing, right, they're needing nutrients for the growth and development of their new tissues. Well, if those nutrients are not available in the soil, they can, if it's a mobile element, take them from the older tissues and translocate them up to their newer tissues. So as a result, if we see a deficiency in the lower tissues, that deficiency is going to be a mobile element because our plant essentially stole the nutrients from that older tissue found on the lower part of the plant and used it for the new tissue that's growing on the upper part of the plant. And the reverse or the opposite would be true if we were looking at an immobile nutrient such as iron. In that case, we would first see the nutrient deficiency on the new growth, which is found on the top part of the plant. So how do our minerals get into our plants? Well, they're going to go through the roots, right? And our nutrients are charged forms of the elements, or referred to as ions. And the important thing I want you guys to know is that they get into the roots through active transport. And this is a process that requires energy, or ATP, again, that energy currency of the cell. And this is often, I've touched on this already before when we looked at water, right, of how water flows into our plant's roots, it goes through that osmosis. And in order for that to occur, we need to have this buildup of our ions within the plant root. And that buildup occurs through this active transport. Now, I'm going to take a couple slides and look at those primary macronutrients that we talked about, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, nitrogen is required, or our plants require the greatest quantities of nitrogen compared to all other mineral nutrients. And it's actually the most commonly deficient element in plant growing systems. Now, it's very abundant in the air, but has very low availability in the soil. And it's important for our plants because it's found in all proteins and other components of cellular functioning, DNA, RNA, ATP that I've talked about, NADPH and NADH, which we're going to see are important for photosynthesis. Now, your plants can absorb and utilize two forms of nitrogen, ammonium or nitrate. You can get nitrogen from a couple different ways. The breaking down or decomposition of organic tissue can release nitrogen. Actually, lightning strikes can release nitrogen. And nitrogen-fixing bacteria are able to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into usable forms that can be taken up by your plants. Now, our nitrogen-fixing bacteria are in the genus Rhizobia, and they infect legumes, right, which are your peas and beans, soybeans, etc. Now, these rhizobia and our legumes have a symbiotic relationship. So the plant is going to supply the bacteria with some carbohydrates, right? We can get some energy from that. And the bacteria supplies the plant with ammonia, nitrogen, right? It's a lovely partnership that they have evolved. Now, species of rhizobia are specific to particular crops. So your peas rhizobia will only form a relationship with pea plants, bean rhizobia with bean plants, etc. And you'll see that when our plants are infected with this bacteria, they form these nodules that you will see there. Now, if we were going to be planting these and we want to ensure that it's forming this relationship with these bacteria, we can inoculate our legume seeds with this bacteria beforehand. You can buy it commercially and inoculate your seeds, essentially coat your seeds and then plant them. And that would help ensure that you're going to get this relationship that forms. And if you're doing this on purpose, you're trying to increase your nitrogen content of your soil. So that's going to help with that process. Now, besides these natural ways of increasing nitrogen, we have developed a chemical or a synthetic process to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into ammonia. Now, prior to this, if we wanted to have fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer, we needed to go to natural sources, right? And this is not just what I'm talking about with our bacteria, but we would take we would find organic sources that were high in nitrogen. In particular, bat guano or bat poop was a big source. And then we developed this Haber-Bosch process. I think it was developed by Haber and Bosch, although don't quote me on that, but that seems most likely, right? So it was developed in the early 1900s. It's considered to be one of the most important technological advances of the 20th century, and many consider it to be responsible for the Earth's current population explosion, because this allowed us to produce large amounts of chemical nitrogen fertilizer. And it's going to allow us then to grow a lot of plants because we have all this fertilizer and increase our yield and productivity because of this fertilizer. Now, this process uses heat and high pressure to fix nitrogen, so take nitrogen from the air and fix it with methane to produce liquid ammonia. So it's turning it from this gas into a liquid, and then that's mixed into chemical fertilizers, and then those are applied to your plants or applied to a field. Today, chemical fertilizers contribute to about half of the nitrogen input in global agriculture, but this process is very energy intensive and expensive, and it utilizes a lot of fossil fuels. And if we are talking about being a little more sustainable or environmental friendly with our agriculture, this may not be the best process, or at least this allowed for the development of less sustainable agricultural processes, which we'll talk a little bit about at a later lecture. However, again, still important process, still utilized. It's able to produce chemical fertilizers that, again, can be utilized in a more sustainable way. Not saying that this is a terrible process. It just allowed for some less sustainable methods to be utilized. So what does a nitrogen deficiency look like, right? We said it's needed. Nitrogen is needed by our plants in the greatest amount of quantities. It's often the most common deficiency. What does that deficiency look like in our plants? Well, what we'll see is the yellowing of our lower leaves that eventually spreads to the younger upper leaves, and we'll see stunted growth. And again, we're seeing it in our lower leaves because nitrogen is a mobile element, right? As our plants are growing and they need more nitrogen, they're able to take it from their older leaves or their older tissues first. Which now brings us to our next primary macronutrient, phosphorus. Again, phosphorus is important because it's an important aspect of different cellular processes or plant structures. It is generally, following nitrogen, the second most limiting element for plant growth. Now, most phosphorus is tied up in organic material, and its uptake is also affected by soil pH, right? So below 6 or above 8 is going to inhibit phosphorus uptake. And we're going to look at pH in a couple slides and see how it can impact our uptake by our mineral nutrients. And our mycorrhizae are helpful in absorbing phosphorus. So mycorrhizae, I don't know if I've talked about them yet, but they are fungi that, just like our rhizobia, right, our root knot bacteria that form the nodules on our legumes to fix nitrogen, mycorrhizae are fungi that form a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. Where the plant roots, again, can supply the mycorrhizae with some carbohydrates, and the mycorrhizae are able to access nutrients that otherwise couldn't be accessed by your plants. Very, very important in in wild plants, and we're starting to include mycorrhizae as an inoculation in some of our soil media because they are effective in facilitating the uptake of certain nutrients for our plants. Now, phosphorus deficiency is pretty easy to spot, right? Like nitrogen, those deficiencies are going to show up in the lower leaves first, and then they have a characteristically dark green and red or purple color. If you start to see that deficiency, that's what the deficiency looks like. And your plants may become spindly, right? So long and thin. But it's fairly easy. It's actually, probably the easiest one to spot because of that characteristic color that develops. One of the first years I taught, we grew plants in this class, plant science, and then we went on winter break, and I left the plants growing, and then came back a couple months later for next semester, and I think we had grown tomatoes, and you could see the tomatoes had turned this purple color, right? The leaves had turned this purple color. When I applied a little phosphorus to the potting soil, that color went away on our new tissues, and our plants became healthy again. And our last macronutrient is potassium. So again, potassium is important for several different functions, one of which it's critical for those stomata opening and closing. And right, we learned about the importance of stomata when it comes to transpiration and gas exchange. Potassium is more plentiful in the soil, and it's not as easily leached, right? So it's typically, you don't see the deficiency problems in potassium as you do, or it's not as common, right, as it is with nitrogen and phosphorus. But that deficiency will, again, it's mobile, so it's going to affect your lower leaves first, and you usually see a yellowing or browning that starts on the leaf edges, right? That yellowing color is going to be pretty common in most of these nutrient deficiencies. A couple other ones just to be aware of: calcium deficiency. You might commonly see in lettuce, where you get that tip burn, where your tips get soft and rotted. Blossom end rot in tomatoes, where your fruit develops a brown patch. That could be a common deficiency that you might see, and that is related to a lack of calcium. Magnesium, this is kind of a neat one, intraveinal chloriosis, right? So you can see that between our leaf veins, it gets yellow, right? Pretty neat deficiency, or kind of neat looking deficiency. I know it's bad. And iron has the same characteristic, right? It has that intraveinal chloriosis, although it affects the upper leaves first, right? And this is where that mobility plays a role, right? Our iron is not very mobile, so our plant isn't able to take iron from the lower or from the older tissues if it needs it. So as a result, the new growth is going to have that nutrient deficiency first. The opposite is with your magnesium that we saw in the last slide. Right, that last magnesium, you would see this same characteristic intraveinal chloriosis, but you would see it develop on the lower leaves first. Now here's a little guide taken from your textbook of looking at nutrient deficiencies. And again, we're not going to go through all of these, but it's a flow diagram, I guess, flow chart, if that's the correct word. But you would start at the top, and it's going to ask you a question, and then based on the question, you would go to the next one, and hopefully at the end of this, you would get to what your nutrient deficiency is. Some reference for you guys to look at in the future. Now, it's important to note that many plants show similar symptoms to multiple, or can show similar symptoms to multiple nutrient deficiencies, as well as, other plant diseases and disorders, right? So a lot of nutrient deficiencies may look the same or may look similar, and it might be hard to tell them apart. So it's often best to have get your soil tested, and there's different kits you can buy. By the time you're starting to see these nutrient deficiencies, your plant is often severely stressed or damaged. So it's best to do proper growing and proper fertilization, as we're going to talk about in a couple slides, to ensure you're not getting this. It may be important to test both your leaves and soil to get a full understanding of the issue if you are seeing an issue. And just because a plant is showing a nutrient deficiency, it may not be because of low nutrients in the soil, right? You may have a root issue. You may have a watering issue, right? If we have an issue with our roots, like that root rot that we talked about, or if we're not putting enough water or not watering our plants enough, that will cause our stomata to close. And if our stomata are closing, water's not moving into the plant and nutrients aren't moving into the plant, right? So just because we have a nutrient deficiency, it may not be because of low soil nutrients. It could be some other root issue or other growing issue as well. I want to talk about soil pH because soil pH, one of the big things that it does is that it affects the uptake or the availability of these different plant nutrients or these different mineral nutrients in the soil. So pH is a measure of acidity or alkalinity, right? The concentration of hydrogen or hydronium ions, right? With more hydrogen ions being more acidic. A pH of 7 is considered neutral, right? It goes from a scale of 0 to 14, with 7 being considered neutral. Lower numbers are more acidic, higher numbers are more alkaline. Now, plants will vary in their optimum pH levels and range of tolerance. Right? Your plants that you find outside of school, your wild plants, are adapted to a little bit more of a acidic soil, right? They prefer a more acidic soil. Your heath plants like your huckleberries and blueberries, your pine trees, etc. Most of your vegetable crops have a target or an optimum pH range of around 6.2 to 6.8, so just slightly acidic. And like I said, soil pH is important because it affects nutrient availability, but you can also get nutrient-related toxicities if you go to the extremes of these pH ranges. So here's a really good graph that shows how soil pH affects the availability of nutrients. And you can see the green here is where they're most available, right, and towards the edge where they are least available. And you can see how that changes with our different nutrients based on pH level, right? A lot are found, or a lot are readily available around neutral, right, around 7, or within this range of 6 to 7 or so, right? Which is why often a little slightly acidic is what we're shooting for with our soils or our growing mix, as we're going to do in lab. Now, if we get outside of those ranges, we can fall into some nutrient toxicity, right? So plants grown in acidic soils can exhibit aluminum, hydrogen, or manganese toxicity. You could start getting into calcium and magnesium deficiencies because they do a little bit better, are more available in more alkaline ranges. Below a pH of 4, where you get, that's a very, very acidic, you get the hydrogen ions themselves will damage root cell membranes. Now, aluminum, I talked about aluminum toxicity. Why it's a problem in very acidic soils is because aluminum is present in most soils, but it's not water soluble until pH is below 5.2. So when it's below 5.2, aluminum is taken in by the plants, and that can interfere with calcium uptake and the production of ATP and DNA, leading to plant toxicity or plant death. So if we had a very acidic soil and we need to raise the pH of our soil, which is most often the case, at least where we're found, you can apply lime, right? So in agriculture, lime is usually defined as compounds containing calcium or calcium and magnesium. Calcium carbonate is kind of the standard when we were talking about liming soils. If you were going to do this on your lawn or your ag field, you would get a soil test, and that soil test would provide you recommendations. In our potting mixes that we're going to make, if we're using peat is acidic, and we are often going to add some lime to our potting mix to raise the pH of that mix because of the acidity of that peat material that we're using. Now, last thing I want to talk about is fertilizer. So there are a lot of different fertilizer options available, and I'm not going to go too in depth with this because we'll talk a little bit more about this when we do our lab on fertilizer. But in general, you have different types of fertilizer available to you, your synthetic or your chemical fertilizers versus your organic. Now, your chemical fertilizers or synthetic fertilizers are often faster acting and a little more targeted, whereas your organic fertilizers are going to require breakdown by soil microbes or weathering, and maybe they're a little bit less targeted than your chemical ones. You have options whether you want to do a liquid fertilizer or water soluble, so you're making your own liquid fertilizer, or a slow release fertilizer, something like Osmocote, which we'll talk about and I'll show you in lab. Your slow release fertilizers require fewer applications, but they're often a little bit more expensive and you have less control over them. So they are, for the Osmocote as an example, it is a fertilizer that they come in these little balls and they're essentially resin balls. So your fertilizer is coated in this resin, sprinkle it on your soil, or you can incorporate it in different ways. But through time, with heat and water, that resin is going to break down and you have a slow release of fertilizer. So you get an extended amount of fertilizer that gets released into your potting mix over time. So you're fertilizing through time. You only need one application of this fertilizer. But it's not, you have less control over it, right? Because you're not able to dictate that you want this much fertilizer at this exact moment. You're just subject to the natural breakdown of this resin and the release of these fertilizers. Now, as I talked about, our NPK, those are our 3 primary macronutrients. And most fertilizers will list those NPK amounts, and they're always found in that order, right? So if you look at fertilizer, you've seen different values, 10, 10, 10, 20, 10, 20, 4, 4, 4, 3, 16, 0, 1, 2, 3. Those are the amounts of those different nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, by weight in whatever your fertilizer is, right? So for example, if we had a 10-pound bag of fertilizer with an NPK number of 10, 10, 10, it would mean that 10% of that fertilizer by weight would be nitrogen, right? Our first number, that first 10, right? That is percentage. So 10% of your fertilizer by weight is going to be nitrogen. So that would be around a pound, right? 10% of 10 is 1. So in this fertilizer, you would have 1 pound of nitrogen in this 10-pound bag. 1 pound of it would be nitrogen. Now, phosphorus and potassium aren't exact. You don't have that exact amount because phosphorus is often phosphoric acid, which is a little bit of phosphorus and a little bit of oxygen. Potassium is potash, which is the chemical makeup includes oxygen as well. So if you wanted to get the actual amounts of phosphorus in your fertilizer, you would actually need to multiply that value by the amount of phosphoric acid, or you would multiply the amount of phosphoric acid, by a factor of 0.44. Again, I'm not going to make you do this, but it's something to be aware of, right? So if you're looking to, in our 10-pound bag, we know 10% of it is going to be nitrogen, so that gives us a pound of nitrogen. If we wanted to know how much phosphorus, we would actually, that 10 is telling us the actual amount of phosphoric acid. So we would calculate that it has 10% phosphoric acid. So that's another pound of phosphoric acid. But we need to multiply that by 0.44 to get the actual amount of phosphorus, right? Which would be 0.44 pounds. And then potassium, it's the same process. We would get, that number actually tells us the amount of potash, which would be 1 pound of potash, and then we would multiply that by 0.83 to get the actual amount of potassium. So all in all, if we had a 10-pound bag of 10, 10, 10, we would have 1 pound of nitrogen, 0.44 pounds of phosphorus, and 0.83 pounds of potassium. The almost last thing that we're going to look at when we talk about fertilizers are a couple other considerations. The fertilizer rate, the frequency of application, and then the amount to apply. So fertilizer rate, when we're talking about fertilizer rate, we are often almost always talking about the amount of nitrogen. And we often consider fertilizer rate as parts per million of nitrogen, or ppm nitrogen. Now ppm also equals milligrams per liter. And common fertilizer rates could be 50 ppm, 100 ppm, 200, 300. And the rate we use is often going to depend on our frequency of application as well as the plants that we're growing, right? So you can apply your fertilizer with every watering, so every day essentially. That would be like a constant supply feed. You can apply every week, every 2 weeks. It's probably Beyond that, I think would be pushing it. But if you were going to do a constant watering, right, or a constant supply feed, you would use a lower fertilizer rate, 100, 120, maybe even 200. If you're going to do every 2 weeks, you're going to use something higher, like a 300 parts per million nitrogen. And I'll show you in a second how to calculate this if you were trying to make your fertilizer, right? Now, if given this, how much are we actually going to apply? Well, there's different thoughts on this as well. One of the things that you can do is just apply enough fertilizer or enough liquid so it's going to leach out through the bottom of your pot. Now, when it leaches out, it's going to leach out some of those nutrients, right? And what you want to do to make sure you are keeping things good is if you have an electrical conductivity meter, which you can purchase fairly cheap, you get the conductivity of your fertilizer. It'll give you a value. You then will measure that conductivity of your fertilizer leaching out through the bottom of your pot, and you get a value there. As long as they match up, you know that you're fertilizing enough, right? That things are going well. If you had a low value coming out, perhaps you need to apply a little more fertilizer. If you have a higher value coming out, then maybe you're adding a little bit too much or you're not watering enough. But as long as you have same values going in, the same value going out, you're going to be good. And this is important because you don't want, if you don't have enough fertilizer, right, you're not maximizing growth. And if you have too much, you can get fertilizer burn, which is damage from excessive fertilizer application. And generally, you will see this as a browning of the leaf edges or a leaf scorch. What's happening is that all that fertilizer, that's all salts, right? Ions are just salts, right? And they're able to pull moisture out from the root tissues. And as a result, you start to see damage that occurs on your plants. So I think that's it for our lecture today, and I will see you guys on the next one.